So I've been asked to talk about SANS regulations and other laws. Please take note. SANS regulations and other laws. Our biggest problem currently is that all of you sitting here believe that SANS 10400 forms the regulations. And that's the biggest problem that we have. All right, SANS 10400 is not the law. And I will explain that as we carry on. All right, the first legislation we have in the building industry is Code of Hammurabi. That was the king who developed or tried to build the Tower of Babel. And in the hieroglyphics that he printed on clay tablets, he's got actually a 3-page document. But in essence, what it says, if a builder builds a house for an owner and builds the house shoddily, and the owner's son gets killed when the building collapses, then the builder's son will be put to death equally. Right, so tooth for a tooth, eye for an eye. That's what legislation is all about. In our environment, we've got the National Building Regulations, and it stands to provide for the promotion and uniformity of the law relating to the erection of buildings in the area of jurisdiction of the local authorities for the prescribing of building standards and for matters connected therewith. Now, first and foremost, that's legalese, so I'm breaking it down into 4 main components. It says that all buildings in South Africa, uniformity in the law, will be treated equally. So when we look at the building plans, we've got a set of requirements, and those building plans has to satisfy the requirements set. So that's the balance. We only look after buildings that are, or only look after buildings. We are not interested in infrastructure, railways, dams, whatever, except if you build a bridge on a property, like in a shopping center. Then that bridge is part of the building, and we will have to look at that. It falls within the jurisdiction of the local authorities. So the local authority level, the lowest level of government, they administer this legislation. And we do that by prescribing building standards. So you need to know the 10400, South African National Standards 10400, to be able to understand what the prescriptive requirements are for your building to satisfy that. We are a constitutional democracy, and we have 3 spheres of government. We've got national government, we've got provincial government, and we've got local government, recognized in the Constitution. In terms of the National Building Regulations, we've got no influence or no representation at provincial government level. So we only have national government and local government. Local government, through the Cooperative Governance of Traditional Affairs Department and SELGA, administers this legislation according to constitutional decree. The DTI, through ourselves, implement being the implement agent for the DTI to regulate this industry. We use that with the support of the SABS. Sorry, I see it's cut off at the bottom. Is there any way we can fix that? Otherwise, you'll have to just look at the notes, if you won't mind. So I'm trying to paint a mind picture for you so you can understand how this legislation works. I'm an owner, and I want to build a house. Thank you, Muneen. And I want to get a safe house. And the only way for me to do that is by creating a blueprint. So all buildings, ladies and gentlemen, start their life on paper, even if it's in the back of a cigarette box. It is you, the designer, that takes your creative ideas and graphically project that on a piece of paper, which you convey through your skills. Through your skills as a designer, so that some other people can use the paper to furnish at the end of the day your design.
Where were you?
I was there, just at that one. Current slide. All right, so I need to get, that's all right. So I need to get the blueprint done. That same blueprint is developed by the professional team, building environment professionals, usually the architect, conservator, and engineer. That same building plan we use to be submitted to the local authority so that it can be scrutinized to find out, does it satisfy the requirements, yes or no. That same building plan also goes to the construction industry section side. The NHBRC is a regulator there, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But in essence, that building plan is submitted to the local authority. It is then given to the local authority to go through those 4 main scales that I said to you. And the building control officer is then placed under a position to make a decision. Yes, does it satisfy those requirements? And if not, refuse it. If it satisfies that, he will provide an approval, and the building plan is then approved, which allows construction to commence. Construction takes place, there's a couple of inspections being done, and then when we get to the end of the building control officer issues an occupancy certificate. That occupancy certificate is the end of our process in legislation. All right. Up to the stage when a new submission is made, then we follow the whole process again. So that's in essence what we try to achieve. You must understand the building regulations. All new building work in South Africa must comply with the National Building Regulation, as it is the building code. It is a performance-based code, which means it states how a building and its components must perform, as opposed to describing how the building must be designed and constructed. We only are interested in the performance thereof, not in the way you do it. If you ignore the requirements, you are breaking this law. There are 278 municipalities in South Africa, 9 metropolitan sections and 44 districts, making up the full context. This is what South Africa looks like currently legislatively. 2006, we changed from a municipal area comprising of a little town to a wall-to-wall municipality. You must understand that has got great ramifications for us sitting in this room, because previously you only had to submit building plans for the little house that you built in the town. And anything outside of the town was peri-urban, and you didn't have to worry about it, because that was farm. And the law said anything that is auxiliary to farming is allowable. Now, with the wall-to-wall municipalities, it means that all of those farm buildings also needs to be submitted to the local authority. All right, be mindful. It's not part of this presentation, but I need to put this through to you. If you're approached by a client who wants to build a wine cellar on a farm, you have the golden opportunity now for the first submission that you make to include all of the buildings that exist as an outline to say it's an existing building. Then it's captured once and for all, and by your demarcating it as being existing, it automatically gets legal status. All right, so please move forward in that environment. We've got the building control officer, who's the building sheriff in that environment, and he enforces this legislation. Now, the Act is the highest level of legislation after the Constitution. So we get the Constitution right at the top, and then we've got acts made by Parliament. And the 4th clause in the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act says, no person shall, without the prior approval in writing of the local authority, erect any building. So you are not allowed to construct anything in terms of building without first getting the written approval from the local authority. Okay. And then the last part says, any person erecting in contravention of one shall be guilty of an offense. The local authority rely heavily on people informing them of illegal building taking place. And then they will send out the inspectors to go and investigate. Only inform them. It can be anonymous. It can also be that you give them the name, your name, and ask them to give you feedback. All right. So,
is it the compliance officer?
No, it's the building control officer. Right? Remember, the law only recognizes one chap. And each and every local authority has to appoint a building control officer. There is a person called a building control officer within each and every local authority. All right, so those are the processes that we follow. You develop your drawings and your technical documentation before the point of submission. It is then verified by the local authority. It is approved by them. Then only can construction start. There's an inspection regime that takes place. And then the completion is ended when the occupancy certificate is issued. But I specifically want to talk about the third level, the local authority approval level. Under Section 7 of the Act, again the highest part of the legislation, it says if the local authority, I'm not going to read through all of this, but in essence, Section 7 says that when the local authority considers it and is satisfied that your submission complies, it shall grant its approval. It's not may grant, it shall grant. So it has to submit or approve the building application as it stands. On the other side of the coin, if it is satisfied that does not comply, it shall refuse the application. Cut and dried. You'll also see that that same act, that same clause says, is satisfied, complies with the requirements of this act and any other applicable law. Any other applicable law. You must understand the National Building Regulation is the end section. It's the last time that the local authority can either approve or disapprove it. And then it's added onto it this thing about any other applicable legislation. And many of the local authorities have come about to say, no, but any other applicable legislation says because you haven't paid your rates and taxes, they can't approve it. And the courts have brought it down to us to say those are the any other applicable legislations that can be added to this legislation. So you'll have to do environmental, health, electricity, sewer, fire, roads, and town planning. All right, so only within that environment. So if the local authority refuses your application due to the fact that your next door neighbor's dogs are barking, no, they can't do that. And you have then the right to appeal that. Coming back to it, there's a big definition of when you have to submit building plans. Any wall less than 1 meter, not required. Anything higher than 1 meter has to be submitted. All right, excavations deeper than 3 meters has to be approved. And, so it is a section within the regulations that will describe when it is submitted. All right. In the Meyersdal building collapse, when it went to the investigation that took place, the owner stood up. He started building without approved building plans. He was brought into the dock. He said, "Why did you start building?" And he said, "I am a layman, and therefore I appointed an architect as a specialist to take over my responsibility." And the court then said, "Right, sir, you excuse Mr. Architect, come and sit here." So automatically then you become, if you're appointed, you become the responsible person. Because the owner can then prove that due to his laymanship or non-existing knowledge of this legislation, he transferred that onto your shoulders. If your client decides to build without approved building plans, you will be held accountable, except if you've got a paper trail proving that you warned him against it. So you must absolve yourself from that responsibility as you get into that position. All right, so let's talk about the levels of legislation. We've got the Act. We've got the Act. And you can't be an architect if you don't know the Act. I was a associate partner in a company, and then I joined the city of Johannesburg. And I thought I knew this legislation. It took them 6 months to train me to understand how this legislation works. It is very complicated. But as long as you understand there's 3 main levels of legislation, it'll help you in understanding that. So the first one is the Act. And the Act is the empowering legislation. In other words, you can't have this building environment that is regulated if you don't have a law that says that industry shall be regulated. We've got regulations, and they are compulsory. In other words, they are the thou shall part of the building code that we have. And then we've got the third phase, which is the SANS 10400, and they are not compulsory. There are only but one solution that you can offer to satisfy the regulations. To facilitate the national building regulations, they are supported by a deemed to satisfy rules, which forms the 10400 suite of documents. They are called the application of the national building regulation. These deemed to satisfy provisions describe design and construction methods, materials, and technical solutions, which, if applied, will ensure that the building so designed and constructed shall satisfy the functional requirements of the regulation. All right, the intention of this legislation was to create overarching legal technical framework within which regulators could administer the national building regulations. The administration thereof is delegated to the local authorities, but the minister is still allowed to create regulations via ourselves at this stage. Bylaws must be approved by the minister. So if you have a building bylaw within the local authority, then that building bylaw must first be vetoed by the minister to say it is acceptable or not. All right, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. And as I already said, the regulations are supported by a set of 10-400 standards. So this is the Act. Act has got 28 sections, those two being sort of general statements. But it says, where is this Act applied? It tells you what your duties are. It says that the local authority has to approve it. It says how a building control officer must be appointed, what his functions are, and how the local authority has approved that. And then it carries on through a whole bunch of other items which I'm not going to read through. But in essence, that's the empowering part thereof. Okay. You need to be very mindful of what the Act says. And please, I urge you to go and read through them at least. Also very important that there's a section 25 which is called presumption. Now our common national law says you are not guilty until proven by a court of law to be guilty. This section 25 says you are guilty until you can prove your innocence. So different from the national norms that we deal in the legislative environment. All right, so if the building control officer comes there and he serves you with a notice to say you haven't got illegal building work, you have to submit within 30 days, you are guilty at that point. Up to the point where you can bring the drawings to say, here's the approval that has been granted. Also for yourself sitting here, be very, very mindful to inform your clients that the drawings that you do are critically in terms of legal documentation. That approved document that you get, don't rely on the local authority to have a copy. Because this section says you are guilty if you can't produce it. And if the local authority is serving you with notice, it means that they don't have a copy. And then you'll either have to reappoint and go through the same process of getting it approved if you can't prove it. So your approved building plan should go into your safe the same way as your shares or your very important document should go in there. So also understand the value that the law places on the work that you chaps do. You know, we shoot ourselves in the foot the whole time because I'll just quickly do a drawing. But the effort that you put into that drawing is worth gold. And if it's a legal document where it is approved, it is the only document that proves that that building is actually legally standing and is legally there. Also understand that every now and then this legislation changes. And what we've had now, 2011, with the energy efficiency legislation coming in, all of the buildings that were built or added onto illegally prior to 2011, if they now want to regulate them and submit them later on, that building or addition has to satisfy the 2011 requirements, which could be very onerous in old buildings. All right. We're trying to put the screws on everything. We've engaged with the banking sector, and you'll find that in most of the bond requirements currently, if you want to submit or sell an existing house, the banks will request an approved copy of the building plan. All right. And that's to try and close these gaps of all the illegal building work taking place. All right, so we've got the Act, then we've got a set of regulations. These two together form the legislation. And then we've got SANS 10-400. And these are only deemed to satisfy the regulations. All right. So at this point I want to say to you, the Act says buildings shall be regulated. Then in the regulations part, it says for us to satisfy the Act, we have to take the building and break it down into components. And then it goes through all of those components. And if I take the foundation section on that, it says the building's foundations must be strong enough to carry the loads imposed on it. Doesn't give you any description of how it should look like. But if I then go to the SANS 10400 foundation section, it then says in that section, for us to satisfy the regulation, that foundation, if the soil is good, then a 600 by 200 by 450 below natural ground level, 10 MPa concrete strip foundation will satisfy the functional requirement of the regulation. In other words, it would be strong enough as described by the regulation. But that's not the only solution. Because if the soil is clay soil, you can't use a strip foundation. And therefore the legislation opens up that there's one solution given, but you can use others as well. If you use the strip foundation for good soil, good enough, you've got an approval. But if the conditions are such that you cannot use a strip foundation, then you'll have to use one of the other options available to you, right? Which Wynand talked about rational design and also Agrima certificates, which I would also get to later. So, empowering regulations are thou shalt. SANS are not compulsory, they are deemed to satisfy the rules of the regulations. So, this legislation was originally produced as a set of functional requirements for anybody building any type of structure. They were never intended to be prescriptive of how you should build, but rather they give you important do's and don'ts, what you shouldn't be building. So in essence, these are the regulations. Regulation 17 is quite important because that describes how the legislation puts together. Then we've got a whole section of when this legislation came into being, what definitions are available in there. So building, the definition of building would be sitting in that. Then it talks about standards, which specific standards are part of the legislation. So it calls up a couple of standards within that. And then it's got AZ4. And AZ4 I'm going to elaborate on because it's quite important to understand how that fits and gives you solutions to that. There's a section of repeal, and then we've got administrative clause. Also important for you to know the administrative clause because that is what gives you the reasons why you have to submit building plans to the local authority. And then we've got the whole set of components. Also see that we've got sustainable buildings and XA energy efficiency in buildings, the new kid on the block. So there's all the regulations, there's 23 of them, and they've got another 103 sub-regulations in each and every of these sections. Okay, so this is the law, ladies and gentlemen. You have to at all times satisfy these requirements. All right, not the 10400s. The 10400s are solutions. Those are recipes, but this is the functional requirement. This is what you have to satisfy. Right, I have said that already. Section 17, I'm not going to go into much detail. You can read that. But in essence, what it is, you have in Regulation B, which is called structural design. It gives you the regulation, all of it. And then usually the last regulation says, this requirements of sub-regulation 1 and 2 shall be deemed to be satisfied where such building is designed in accordance with SANS 10400 Part B. So it ties up the SANS document to this regulation. It says if you wanted to do a proper design or are deemed to satisfy, you can use the similar section in SANS 10400. So it is the building benchmark. All buildings in South Africa has to comply with that. These are the regulations again. I'm copying. I'm trying to imprint this into your minds. We've got a set of regulations. These regulations form part of the National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act, the Act part thereof. The NRCS is responsible for developing the regulations and maintaining them. Minimum requirements. And then we've got the SABS on the other side that provides for us the SANS 10400. Now the SANS 10400 are developed by technical committees, and these technical committees are seen as industry specialists. So when we develop floors, for instance, we rely very heavily, or the SABS relies very heavily on expertise from industry. And I must say I'm very grateful for the beginning of this year, PIA is represented as part of the technical specialists sitting within that group. All right. So then they then take the regulation. Let's go back to foundations. The foundation must be strong enough. And they say, okay, what recipe can we give to satisfy the regulation? And then they unpack SANS 10400 foundations. All right. And they put the 10400 together. So this comes from your industry. You are represented at those technical committees. Work groups, 10400 Part A, 10400 Part B, C, all of the chairman of these various working groups, each dealing with one of the SANS 10400s, is represented at a technical committee 60. Right? That's the overarching technical committee. And all legislation, or all of these SANS 10400s are approved at the technical committee 60. So that we've had a problem with XA saying that insulation shall not be compressed when it's over purlin applied. Then Part K, Part L, which is roofs, when it got to that stage, he said, whoa, you can't do that. Because we don't have stuff in place to provide a spacer between the roof sheeting, for instance, and the purlin. And how are you going to achieve not compressing the insulation at that point? So suddenly then everybody ran away, and Part L then started re-looking at the roofs. How can they come up with a solution? And you'll see that Part L will be published now. There is no solution not to compress that. So that's in essence how this system works, is that yes, one part will lag another part, but in essence it's moving hopefully in the right direction. Remember, the building code deemed to satisfy is only one of 3 voluntary solutions. There's the regulations. You can see there's a mirror image in SANS 10400. So for every regulation that exists, in other words, legal requirement, SANS 10400 provides you with a solution to the legal requirement. It's the National Building Regulation, minimum requirements in the regulations, and one of 3 solutions offered. Okay, so let's try and unpack that even further. I'm not moving forward, I'm doing the same thing over and over because I need to cement this idea in your mind so you understand how it works. We've got the Constitution sitting at the top, highest level of legislation. Then we've got an act made by Parliament, and this is called the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act. And then we've got a set of regulations, which is our responsibility. Both the Act and the regulations are mandatory. That's the law. Of course, they cannot be in conflict with the Constitution. All right. So that's the building law, and this is the building solutions. SANS 10400, they provide the performance requirements, and then there's other South African national standards, which are voluntary in nature, totally voluntary in nature. The 10400s, though, are linked to the regulations because the regulation says, usually the last part of the regulation says, for you to satisfy this regulation, go to SANS equal, the mirror image thereof. All right, can I get your attention just a little bit? Wynand talked about the review board. Now, the Constitution has given the powers of administration of this Act to the local authorities. So that's their responsibility. The review board was a mechanism that was placed in our Act since 1977 to say that if you didn't agree with the decision made by the local authority, you had the right to appeal to a body called the Review Board to adjudicate, to find out, is the interpretation of the section within 10400 or the regulations intended and applied correctly. And the complainant will say, no, this is the reason why I believe they found it incorrectly. The Review Board then called technical specialists together from that specific area. If it is in the case of fire, they will call the fire specialists together and present them with the problem. And the specialist will then say, no, this is the right way of interpreting it. And if the local authority was correct, they will say, the local authority is correct. Or they will say, no, the local authority was incorrect due to the following reasons. And that then became the way that we applied the legislation going forward. Now the Constitution said, no. You can't have higher authority overriding local authority because the Constitution has given them the right to do that. And there can't be an appeal mechanism to override that. All right. And that's why the Review Board has been found unconstitutional in a High Court. It has now gone to the Constitutional Court. The hearing was held last month, and we haven't received the thing back yet. So we're still waiting what is going to happen at the end of the day. My biggest concern is none of the architects in South Africa stood against the decision by the courts. So it's actually gone through, and I believe in the Constitutional Court hopefully will apply their minds with it. Regulations are freely available. You go to the internet, you type in National Building Regulations, you'll get them. They documents there. The problem is they're not in your face. All right? The SANS 10400 is in your face because all of you should have a copy of it in your offices. You have them in their offices as well, because under the current regime, the regulations are attached to each and every one of those SANS 10400s as an addendum. All right? But because they're addendum, they're not seen as being important. We're moving towards going back to the old way where the previous National Building Regulation had a blue section, printed in blue, which was the regulation. And then it said, for you to satisfy the regulation, this is what you had to do. So we're going back to that position, or to that one. What we did is we put in Form 1 specifically to put you on the spot. Because when we got to court, the court said, Mr. Architect, were you aware of the fact that when you submitted the building plan, you as the professional took responsibility for ventilation in this building? And the architect said, no, I never looked at that. That's a mechanical engineer. So now we've put that form up there that you physically tick it to say, I have taken consideration of it, so that you don't get caught unawares when you get to court. So that's in essence why it's that first box. So it's a tick box specifically so that you can apply your mind to say, I have thought about this, I have thought about this, I have thought about it. And that document becomes a legal document that goes to record. All right. So, if we follow the deemed to satisfy solution, the 10400 solution, automatically you'll get an approval. All right? It's a no-brainer. It's a paint by numbers exercise. You use the requirements in 10400 and you will automatically satisfy the regulations and also the Act. But if we look at Regulation AZ4, use the Nordic model. We are not doing this in isolation. That TC60 that I pointed out to you, that TC60's chairman sits on the international ISO TC60. So South Africa is represented internationally, and we try and stay in step with what the world is doing. So if there's changes in legislation internationally, the chairman will bring it back to us, and we will make sure that we duplicate or copy or bring some other South African solution to it. So we're not running in South African. This is internationally linked legislation. And that's why they call that the Nordic model. So if I take it, we've again got the Constitution at the top, but in our case we've got the Act which sets the goal. The building industry shall be regulated. Then we've got a set of regulations, the functional requirements. The foundation must be strong enough. And then we've got SANS 10400, which provides you the performance, 600, 200, 450, 10 MPa concrete. So when you submit your building plan, the building control officer, through the process of uniformity in the law, is it a building, is it in the local authority sphere, and have you used the standards, will then evaluate your application. And there's 3 ways of satisfying that. The first one, which is the no-brainer one, is you use the recipe given in SANS 10400, because that is an automatic approval. If the 10400 says your fire escape must be 1.5 meters wide, and you show the fire escape to be 1.5 meters wide, approval. All right. But now there's a pillar somewhere in, and you can't get a 1.5 meter clearance. Then you can't use the SANS 10400 because you are not satisfying that recipe. What I usually say at this stage is that you must understand, if I go to Kook en Geniet or the Sari's cookbook, and it tells me this is a fail-safe recipe to bake scones, and you can deviate a little bit on all sides of that recipe, you will always get scones. They might not be so great, but they'll be scones. But if I'm sitting in a 5-star hotel, I'll be shot as a chef if I bring you those scones. Through my contextual knowledge, my experience, my education, will bring out a Gordon Bleu scone. Right? And if I don't follow it perfectly to the ounces, and I put that scone down there, it'll be fantastic scones compared to the normal scones. Now the normal scones is the deemed to satisfy. The Gordon Bleu scones are a rational design. All right. So if I take a roof truss is described in SANS 10400. It's a thick, hefty roof truss, bolted and nailed together. That roof truss will stand anywhere in South Africa. Doesn't matter what the wind conditions are, doesn't matter what the nature is going to throw it at. It will stand. But it's heavy and therefore expensive. So if I want to go and put up a specific roof in a specific area related to that climatic conditions, I go to an engineer, and it might be hydronail because it's an engineered solution, and they will give me a monoplane roof truss with plates attached, and they will certify that this thing will work here. All right. So that's the difference. The one is this heavy, oversized keel will always satisfy the law compared to this designed specifically for that application. All right. So when I then submit building plans to the local authority, the easiest way to get an approval, and that's what we have always been using as architects, we use the deemed to satisfy requirements. And that will automatically satisfy the regulations, because the regulation says if you use 10400, you will get an approval. The second one, which we don't use that often, is our Agreement certificate. And the Agreement certificate is you go to Agreement SA, which sits at the CSIR, and you build the process with them. They will then test it to the similar test used by 10400, and they will then say this product that you've put together here satisfies the legislation, and therefore it is fit for that purpose, and they will give you a certificate. You will submit your building plan with that certificate. Innovative building technologies, these prefab schools that we are now currently building, all of them come through the Agreement process, because the National Building Regulation measures in bricks and mortar. And anything that's not bricks and mortar, they can't measure, and therefore you go Agreement. The easiest example of an Agreement certificate is a concrete prefab wall, a plank and supports. That's Agreement certificate process. And that certificate says that this wall will be built as a garden wall anywhere in South Africa, and it can be used for a garden wall, but it's not for habitable purposes. So therefore we can't use prefab walls to build houses with at this stage. All right, and then the third one, which is the problematic one, is us using engineered principles or rational design. And the way that we have to do that means it's a design by a competent person involving a process of reasoning and calculation, and which may include a design based on standards or other suitable documents. In fact, if you are a rational designer, you don't even have to submit building plans to the local authority. That's how drastic this legislation allows. For instance, the beam over the Moses Mabhidla Stadium in Durban, the building control officer for Durban happens to be an engineer. But that beam is done by a consortium of international engineers. Now, when they submitted those drawings under rational design to the local authority, that engineer didn't say, no, bring me your calculations and give me your bending schedules and what concrete you're going to use. He stood back and said, I bow to your superior knowledge, just carry on with the work. And he took that certificate, the rational design certificate, and put it on file. Anything goes wrong, he takes out the file. He doesn't get involved. That's the intention of a rational design. Now, with energy efficiency, we open the door for the first time for the architectural profession also to do rational designs. Because it makes logical sense that the first line that you draw for any building, if it is not orientated correctly, it's going to be very expensive down the line to make it energy efficient. All right. You've been caught up in the trap currently of being called competent in that environment, and for you to do a rational design with that. Very dear old architect phoned me one day and he said to me, Mr. Opperman, I've been practicing since I finished, and I'm now 70, I think it was 73 years old. Are you telling me I'm not competent to do a rational design? And I had to do some fancy dances around. I said, no, sir. But tell me, how many energy efficient buildings have you done in your lifetime? And he said, no, I haven't. And I said, but that's why you cannot be deemed a competent person in terms of energy efficiency. You might be a brilliant architect, but if you have no experience, education, contextual knowledge in energy efficiency, you cannot be described as such. All right. So we're moving away in the new 10400 XA, which we hope to get out by the end of this year, away from the strictly calculation environment, which we believe is rubbish, more towards proper design and using architectural elements. But we'll still see, we're still battling because we've got a very diverse team of specialists on that, and everybody wants to see their environment and their business related in that. All right. Yes, sir.
If the architect is deemed to be a competent person, why does council want to see the calculation?
The challenge comes in that there is confusion, not only in this environment, but also in the local authority environment, as to is it a rational design or is it just the extension of the 10400? Because by just doing calculations, and rightfully so, you follow the 10400 and there's tables everywhere and you do calculations for everything. Your sewer calculations for your population and blah, 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 blah. All of those. It's just plain for calculations, but that's still part of 10400. Now, why is the window calculations different than those calculations? And that's the challenge that we're sitting with. So it's brand new legislation. It came in with its warts and all. We're trying to streamline it going forward. All right. But it's not there yet. We'll hope to get there still. And just quickly on the competent person discussion with Wynand, you must understand only SACAP can decide if you're competent, yes or no. You go to university, you follow the prescriptions laid down by the South African Council for Architects, and once you've satisfied all of those requirements, you get a degree which is recognized by SACAP, and they will call you an architect. All right. No other body has the right to decide if you're competent or not. We've got fire engineers who are not engineers, who are ex-firemen, who are calling themselves fire engineers, and they're submitting dubious rational designs, and it's caused havoc. And we're slowly starting to get the same thing happening in the architectural field, not so much the engineering field, although they've also got their problems. Okay, so understand, when you apply according to Regulation A19, when you apply according to Regulation A19, you have to prove to the local authority that you are competent. And he must sit there with what you provide to him and make a call to say, okay, you carry on as a competent person, yes or no. All right. With the energy efficiency, we had that national rollout of trying to train up people in the calculations of how to determine the energy efficiency. And if you have a little attendance register or a attendance certificate, that helped the building control officer to look and say, okay, this chap has been exposed to this legislation, but you, as the competent person, still carry the responsibility. All right, so that was one of the solutions. Then when we brought out that solution, we were wrapped over the knuckles by SACAP to say, but how dare you bring in training that is not recognized by us and telling our professionals that they're not competent in that field. So we then totally just retracted all of that and said, we're not interested in proving who is competent going forward. All right, so when you do a rational design, we've got a peer certification section, which is the rational assessment side, and we've got a rational design section, and the rational design has to be proved by well-established engineering principles. All right, so in other words, if the local authority wants to question the competent person in terms of his solution, then they have no right to interrogate. They have no right to come and say, no, but I want it changed. As Wynand has said, they then become part authors of that solution. But what they can do is they can send the rational design to the organization that you are registered with and ask them to do a peer review on your rational design. All right, so it's not the building control officer's job to check that your work. He believes in your qualifications, but if he feels seriously intimidated by your solution, he can then revert it back to, in our case, SACAP, and ask SACAP to put a panel together to have a look at it and say if it's good enough, yes or no. So then it'll be your peers that will be looking at your solution. Regulation A19, critical. Remember, it's part of the legislation. And there's the whole thing about competent person. All right. And in essence, competent person is just the door that we opened to allow a person to certify that he is good enough to do the job, but he takes responsibility. Something goes wrong now or in the future, the competent person will be held liable. But that person must be registered first and foremost, so that we have an organization to which we can do the peer review. Must be qualified by virtue of his education. Must have training in the field that he's taking responsibility for, and he must have experience and contextual knowledge within that environment that he's applying for it. Okay. Specifically on the fire side, and that's why Wynand and ourselves are doing this thing internationally or nationally, is that we get old firemen who are deemed to be competent, who will look at a design and say, sir, but you know what, if you appoint me, I can save you 10% on the cost of the fire by doing a rational design. And then they very dubiously bring up a solution which is life safety threatening. And they step back and the fire chaps look at this and they say, but this is crazy, you can't do it. And then we've got the problem between the fire marshal and the fire rational designer. And the question is then asked, but do you run into the building 3 o'clock in the morning when it's burning? because that's their fault. But 100% right, Philip. That's the crux of the matter. Try and refrain from going rational design at all times. The 10400 that is provided for you is a good enough recipe to do. All right. Good. So what can go wrong? If we don't obey the rules of the law, we've got serious problems. This is the eThekwini town mall, Tongaat town mall. And we had 2 people killed there. I've given you the write-up there so you can read through it what it was. But in essence, this chap from the beginning submitted a building plan for an excavation deeper than 3 meters. The city council did not approve that because the zoning rights were not in place. So any other applicable legislation couldn't be satisfied. And they started serving notice on him as he was building. And every time they served notice on him, he escalated his building program, so much so that at the stage when it collapsed, he was running on a 24/7 building program. Lights up and just going. Building control officer, engineer, very, very prudent in his workings. He did everything according to the book. But the only way that it then goes through to court. And the court must then, at the end of the day, issue a contempt of court ruling, and then in terms of the contempt of court ruling, get the person to jail. The contempt of court ruling was issued 3 days after the building collapsed and killed 2 people. All right, so the legislation is difficult in that regard. We've got the Orlando Power Station, big old power station, due to the Monuments Council getting involved, and they said, no, you can't continue developing this thing. The building was just stood and neglected. The inhabitants started stripping the building of its steel, and the building eventually collapsed like a domino. We had 4 people killed. Then on Monday, 3 kids killed by a warehouse in Doornfontein. We've got this peculiar thing in our CBDs currently, whereby people have made so much money out of their buildings that they abandon the buildings. Because to maintain and make the buildings usable again in a downtown area like, downtrodden area like Doornfontein, it's just not worth it. So they just walk away from the building. Vagrants move in there, the building gets rotten on its foundations, and eventually it collapses and we've got people killed. So 3 people killed there. Also demolition by neglect. We've had situations in court whereby the owner stood there and we were busy with legal matters when they're in Johannesburg, and he physically takes the title deed and he says, Your Honor, here's the title deeds. I now formally hand the title deeds over to the city of Johannesburg. It now becomes their problem. I hear you. And the city said, no, we don't want the problem. But we understand also where we're starting to delve into is we're trying to solve social ills by legislation. Right? If I lock up my building and I prevent anybody from having access to the building, I can leave it. There's nothing in law that says I have to use it, and I have to trade, and I have to do whatever. All right. But the owner stays responsible. But now if I've locked it up, and as that picture shows, he's bricked up the wall or the windows from the inside. Right? He's tried everything in his power to prevent somebody entering. But they break down the wall and they enter. He's not responsible anymore because he's done everything in his power to try and keep it out. And once the vagrants move in there, then the Squatter Act falls into place and all of the other stuff comes into it. So then they just abandon the buildings. And the drill hall in Johannesburg, for instance, lovely old beautiful Victorian building, was demolished in the same manner. Eventually burned down, 6 people killed, and the structure was unstable to such an extent that we could then get a demolition order going.
Don't go any further.
Right?
You have to break.
Okay. Well, I've got 3 more slides. Let me just quickly run through them. The paperwork's there.
No question.
Meyersdal, as I've already alluded to the fact, the owner continued building without getting the approval of building plans. That's what he intended building, and that's what happened to it. That this pillar here was built on an existing wall that had no foundation, and then she came down. This is still our worst accident we've had to date. Seven people killed, 11 injured. Then we've got down in Kailicha, Aussie's Tavern, and there we had 6 people died and another 2 died en route due to the fact that the building didn't satisfy the National Building Regulation. But we've got this peculiar legislation that some parts are required to satisfy this law and other parts not. Kailicha, the establishment of the township, third clause in the establishment conditions says the National Building Regulation will not be applicable in this legislation or in this township. Yeah, but it's legislated in their own legislation. So now I've got these 2 contradicting laws, right? And which one is going to have power? So what happened there is that they, end of the year exam, they have a big party. They moved into this big building. It's actually a 50 by 100 meter length of nightclub on the 2nd floor. That is the only entrance and exit to that whole thing. And they were all in there. Somebody fired a shot apparently. They all ran out of the building, and there was a whole bunch of people trying to get in, and this is where the stampede took place, and there was 8 people killed. First and foremost, the 2 biggest parts of legislation that we deal with is the town planning and the National Building Regulations. Now, town planning, and I don't think you've got this slide with you, is predominantly geared at the overall well-being of the area, whereas the National Building Regulation looks after nuts and bolts. All right. Now, previously, we allowed building plan submissions to take place in spite of the fact that the town planning rights were not in place, so as to try and assist with the development. But then the pressure was placed on the building control officer. Why isn't he performing? Because I submitted the building plan 6 years ago and you haven't approved it. Meanwhile, the rights to the property has never been approved. All right. And we then made a decision to say the building control officers will only allow submission once the rights are in place, or if the town planning department has given the authority for the building plans to be processed. Okay. To try and get the pressure, and a couple of chaps said, yes, we're getting the MMC involved and whatever, and the pressure goes back to the building control officer. And the land rights has got nothing to do with him. So he's got no authority to try and expedite or place pressure there to make it work. Where if the pressure is placed on the town planning department, there should be things happening. So we had the situation of the building control officer taking the responsibility on behalf of another section, and they just laughed at it the whole time because they were out of the picture. All right, that's the one. The other one was homeowners associations. Right? We've got Constitution, we've got Act 103 of 1977, National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act. We've got the SANS 10400 deemed to satisfy requirements. Other standards, bylaws. All right. Now, the Constitution allows the local authority to make bylaws, but any bylaw that is in contradiction with any of the levels of legislation above that is automatically null and void. All right. The bylaw is only there to stop a gap that exists within the legislation. So we've got a couple of problems. Grey water, for instance. There's nothing for grey water. So the Water Act and the local authorities are now creating bylaws to provide requirements for grey water recycling. All right. Eventually, the Act or the regulations will catch up, and we'll have law for it. But it's a shortcoming currently. And once the regulation has been promulgated, automatically bylaws become obsolete, except in cases where there is specific problems to that specific area. Let's say Kuruman has got very aggressive acidic soil. And they then bring out a bylaw that says you will not plant any pipes underground that can be affected by acidic soil. That's a specific requirement for that area. All right. doesn't clash with national legislation. It only stops a hole that exists in that environment. Homeowners Association is not legislation. It is agreement. In other words, when I buy into a cluster development under the Sectional Title Act, a body corporate must exist. And the body corporate sets up a list of rules. And by signing for the offered purchase, you at the same time buy into those rules. And therefore the body corporate can say whatever they want in it. The Mayor's Dole collapse that I showed you there, the body corporate approved the drawings. So that was good enough for the owner not to have to submit it to the local authority. All right. So aesthetically, in many cases, the homeowners association wants to get their fingers in the pie, and they will then look at how you build it and give additional rules to it. But remember, that's a contractual agreement, not a legislative requirement. Okay. Then the other question I had has got to do with occupation certificates. Occupation certificates only became legislated requirement in 1996. So any building that was built prior to 1996 would not have an occupancy certificate. And many of the financial institutions now ask for the title deeds, the approved document, and the title deed. So we have spoken to the building control officers to say, if you go to them and prove that the buildings were submitted and completed before 96, they do not require a occupancy certificate, but the local authority will give you a happy letter to say that was not a requirement in terms of legislation, but this building satisfied the legislation at the time when it was built. And hopefully that will suffice to the people requesting such occupancy certificate. There's 278 local authorities. They have expertise of differing levels. The metros are still at this stage okay, all right? But as soon as you go out of the metros, we are seriously concerned of what's happening there. So what I'm just saying to you is that be very mindful. Most of the cases when you go to the smaller local authorities, you will get approval very quickly, due to the fact that they don't know anything about the national building regulations. As soon as you go to the bigger ones, they've got people. As I just said, eThekwini, Durban, the building control officer there is an engineer. Why do you think you need to submit engineer certificates? There is a section within the Act that says the local authority can ask for additional information. So it asks for that. So if there's reasoning behind it, why they need it, they can do that. And Tongaat Mall is given that reason. All right. The other one is floor stories. There's a definition in the National Building Regulation. Use it. As-built drawings. Do you know what that is? What is an as-built drawing? Doesn't exist. But we use that. It's become part of our terminology. All right. And that then backfires at us. So we say, no, we'll carry on with the building work, we'll just do it as built when we're finished. And then something goes wrong, and you can't get it approved because you've broken the law. Right. And then, due to our normal way of speaking, we say, but it was as built, I was bringing this as built to you. So don't go there. Right. Try and stay within the terminology. 100% right, it is not a first floor. It is a story, because there's a definition thereof. All right. So try and use that environment. It's going to make life easier. Yes, we've got a challenge. If you take the same requirement to the 278 local authorities, you'll most probably get 280 different interpretations. We are trying to address that, and very mindful of what Wynand said about promises. But we do get the building control officers together once a year, whereby we have a conference and we put down pertinent items and new changes to legislation to try and get them on the same page. And then we've got a quarterly meeting with representatives from those building control departments, who we then talk about with problematic cases. All right, and I'll bring up that thing. But that's one of our main problems. I know that we've had differing requirements for submission documentation. Each and every local authority comes up with their own rules. But remember, those rules are currently in the 10400. It's not in the regulation. So they are entitled to chop and change that. We have said at some stage, let's turn it into a regulation. Then it's above board, all of the local authorities. 2006, Municipal Systems Act, the definition of municipality, which was previously the town or the city, and demarcated beyond that was peri-urban. That changed to wall-to-wall municipalities. All right. So our legislation says that it applies to the municipal area. So suddenly now, municipal area has been expanded. So all of the areas around, which were previously not part of the National Building Regulation, has now, by a stroke of the pen, become part of it. So all buildings now are regulated. Thus said, with our historic past, we've got very checkered environments. Our previous homelands, none of the buildings comply, none of the buildings were ever submitted, none of the buildings are according to the National Building Regulation. How do we get them on board? It's one of our challenges. The National Building Regulation holds the owner responsible. 2/3 of KwaZulu-Natal belongs to the king. He's responsible. He's never had to be responsible. So when we start talking these things, we are starting to get really involved in the land issue in South Africa. The occupation of the abandoned building, it is a social ill. We can't address it in this legislation. The land issue we cannot address here. A small little town called Clanwilliam. I get a complaint from somebody stating that the Act says that after written submission is made to the local authority shall issue an occupant certificate within 48 hours. This chap phoned me and says he's waiting 48 days and he's received nothing. So I phoned the building control officer, and the building control officer said to me, yes sir, he's 100% correct. I'll send you a copy of my diary. I am fully booked for the next 48 days. I cannot satisfy the legislation. And then he started talking to me. He's got something like 4 towns, and I speak under correction, I can't remember the specific numbers. He's got over 820 farms and the 8 towns or 4 towns that he has to manage. He's one-man show. You must understand those dynamics also. So what you asked is for him to come and have a look at the building. It's not his job in the first instance. All right? You sitting in this venue are the professionals that do the drawings, submit them, and get them to the local authority, and then the process follows. They are not advisors. They will not come out and come and kick the wall and say, no, it's strong enough. It's not their function. All right? So be mindful of that. Also, try and help those chaps. What I constantly say, understand we are in the same industry. Don't see the building control officer and his staff as your enemy. They've got serious challenges which we are not aware of. So assist them rather as seeing them as your opponents. And it's difficult. I always say when I had to submit building plans at least 3 weeks beforehand, you start developing these lumps in your neck. In the morning you wake up, not much sleep, and those lifts open up and somebody walks past and they say to you, good morning. My response was, what do you mean? What? I was ready for the battle. And that's not doing us any of us any good. So let's quickly recap a little bit. Local authorities, expertise very low. Even in the metros, the architects' drawings get more flack than the plan natracker because the architect provides more information. All right, so that's in essence what it's all about. Local authorities smaller, usually there's no skill, so they just bang, 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 and it's done. In your case, there's some people there that do their work, and most probably are zealous in doing that. But you must also understand we're sitting in an environment where politicians are very, very strong. And we're starting to pick up situations whereby politically driven committees are put together and the building plans are forced through them. And then you get funny requirements. It's got nothing to do with the national building regulation being added to it. So that's one of the things over there. If the building control officer refuses any building plan as per regulation 07, he has to inform you in writing what he is refusing and why he's refusing it. And you can ask him to refer to the clause in the 10400. So that you can tie him down to that legislation. So if he comes up and he says the next door neighbor's dogs are barking, right? You say, but it's got nothing to do with this legislation. All right. And there's a couple of court cases that has cemented that in place. With the review board gone, the NRCS and myself was part of the review board. So previously we just said, don't come to us because then you forfeit the right to the review board, because then we've got insight to the problem. Due to the constitutionality that says the national government doesn't have any right to interfere in local government matters, you can contact me. I'll give you all the advice you want. But the Constitution prohibits me from talking to the local authority. The Constitution doesn't allow me to influence the local authority. They must make their own decisions. All right. We're at this stage still in a position whereby the local authorities are, as I said, under pressure with skills and personnel, and they welcome any input. So 90% of the time when I speak to them, they say, oh, thank you, now we've got an answer. All right. But I don't know how long that window is going to last. So you are welcome to contact me, but make sure that you do it in terms of the legislation. All right. Don't come with personal other stuff.